Schmidt. We're here with David Lauer. It's July 21st, 2025, and we're at Bryn Mawr Vineyards, Salem. David, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having.
First question, why wine?
Why wine? It was not the intention by any means. So I was 15 years old when my family purchased a 4-acre vineyard and a little garage winery that came with the name Bryn Mawr. I was growing up in San Diego, which is a pretty rad place to grow up, and 15-year-olds don't exactly love interruptions to stability, so I kind of refused to even consider anything about this. To me, wine was part of our family. You know, my parents' primary social group was their wine tasting group. They met one Sunday a month for about 15 years straight. I knew the importance of wine in their life. My parents had a wine cellar. They did wine travel. And I never had necessarily a negative connotation about wine until it messed up my world in a certain way. I actually wound up staying down in San Diego. I was being recruited to play men's volleyball in college, and Amity High School doesn't exactly have a thriving men's volleyball program. So my grandparents were down there, my mom's practice was down there, and at that point, Bryn Mawr, I mean, it was so small, my dad could still basically do part-time. And I decided to go up to college in New York City, to New York University, and I thought that I was going to be somebody. New York is a great place to visit. It's a very different place to live, especially as a college student with no money. It was my second year there. It was a very long and tough winter, and I just needed to get out by that summer. I had visited Bryn Mawr a couple times at that point. We had planted more grapes. We had put some work into the property. What was 4 acres of grapes and 11 acres of blackberry vines was now 15 acres of grapes. And, after a couple years in the city, suddenly open sky seemed like a pretty good idea. New York is also great for teaching you the importance of food and wine in life. It's, the table is one of the few actual common gathering spaces in New York. And those 2 hours you spend with friends at dinner somewhere can really be like the only escape you can get. So I came back really just to work in the vineyards for a summer. It was the summer of 2014, which was a very warm year, especially June and July. And it was the first time I had to get up at 6 so I could be done by 2 before it got too hot. It was the first time I had actually worked like a physical manual labor job. And one of the first things I did was leaf pulling. And on one hand, leaf pulling should be truly the most mindless work, and I absolutely loved it. And I loved that I could look back and see the leaves on the ground stretching behind me. You could actually see the progress of the work that was being done. And at the end of the day, you were tired and felt rewarded. And so through the rest of that summer, I spent most of the time in the vineyards. I started to just really appreciate being connected to the ground, seeing the differences in the blocks. And the following summer, I decided to come back with a little more of a focus on the cellar. So I started helping out with the cellar-driven tasks. That was my first time working with Rachel, really directly, our winemaker. Rachel, I know she's told her story here as well. It's a hell of a story. And she's a hell of a woman. She's one of those people, you can't talk to Rachel for more than 10 minutes without physically feeling this sense of just enthusiasm and tenacity and dedication. And it also helps that she's cool as hell. She's so cool. And the number of times she sent me off to Wikipedia to go down a rabbit hole about some crazy topic that I thought was going to be a simple question. She's thinking about things at such a high level. And you can't be around someone like that and not want to continue conversations and to know more and to get even deeper into things. So that's definitely when I guess you could say I started to catch the bug a little bit. After I graduated from college, I studied psychology with a minor in Spanish. I thought, college was not my favorite thing. I did it. It was fine, but I really was looking forward to a bit of a break. So I came back. This was in 2016 when we were still making wine in our garage in an old wedding tent. And 2016 was my first full harvest, where I really got to see the wines through the entire process. And like, what a harvest that was. Like, what a vintage. 16 still, even if it didn't have the sentimental values, the quality of the wines that year were just so outstanding. That year it also rained like 27 days in October while we were trying to ferment the grapes. And we were still making wine outside in an old tent. And it just felt like really like kind of grungy and raw, and yet out of those conditions we made these absolutely superlative things. And what was supposed to be 1 year, now we're at a year and a half, and now we're talking about building a new tasting room, moving out of the garage. And I kind of set this idea of like, well, I was running our tasting room at that point, and I was like, I'd kind of like to see what we could do in a new space and what a transition would look like. And I was like, I'll give it another year, we'll build the building, it'll all be good. It took longer than a year to build that building, as buildings are wont to do. We didn't actually open our new tasting room until about 2019. So that initial 1 year break became a 3 year dedication. And not many people have the chance in their early 20s to really grow and develop in such a substantial way with a business. I got to really set the tone of what a tasting at Bryn Mawr Vineyards was like. And a big part of it was that for those first 2.5 years, we did not have windows. We did not have bathrooms. We did not have heat. And my main job was essentially distracting you from how cold you were by pouring you great wines and telling a really good story. And we take a lot of pride in our more storytelling-driven approach with our wine tastings here. At the same time, I was also racking the barrels, and I was also riding the forklift and part of the whole winemaking process. So that combination of education and storytelling is what makes a wine tasting so magical. And at the age of 24, I was running our entire DTC program as we were moving into this beautiful new space, as we were really growing and taking off as a business. And that sense of reward was just so awesome. And getting to know our club members and getting to, watch a couple who was dating get engaged here, and then they get married, and then they bring their first kid up, and like, oh, we're actually a part of the local tapestry here. It's not just what's going on in this property. It's part of what makes the Willamette Valley such a great place for so many people. Didn't hurt that all my friends also happen to be in the wine industry. And yeah, I just, I don't want to call it like quicksand, but the deeper you get into it, the harder it is to get out. I will say COVID threw things for a loop, no doubt. I, at that point, still had a pretty heavy cellar focus, but the tasting room was growing too big to be able to do both anymore. And I really thought I wanted to stick in the cellar, and I was like, you know what? I think it's time to do the traveling winemaker thing, to do the harvest in the different hemispheres. January of 2020, I actually went to New Zealand to spend a month there, visiting, amongst the beautiful natural sites, all the different wine regions, not just Marlborough, but Martinborough, Otago, Canterbury, Nelson. I mean, really, really trying to get a sense of like where I could go and find a good home. And I actually had my heart set on Martinborough and the North Island, south part of the North Island. I found the Pinots there to be just so aromatic and beautiful, and the main story there is wind. The winds that come through the channel that separates the two islands. The main story of Bryn Mawr Vineyards is wind. I mean, behind me is the Van Duzer corridor. We used to be one of the only vineyards that really directly stared at it. Now a lot more have realized that higher elevation western exposure up here can be advantageous, but I mean, the winds blow so strong on this site, we can't use stems on our tasting room deck because they blow off the tables. That is the singular defining feature of Eola Amity Hills, and we are at the top of the hills, right? So I thought that going to a region really defined by wind as well would be such a great idea, great decision. If I had been there 2 weeks longer, I probably would still be in New Zealand because that's when the borders closed. Came back here in this new tasting room that we had just finished. We had to shut down. We had to change our service styles. You know, as the quote-unquote manager and the head guy on the floor and the family representative, it was my job to enforce all the rules and policies, and that was difficult on an emotional level. It really, you know, not only had I had this goal and this dream and this desire to travel and make wine kind of snatched from me, but I had to deal with a lot of folks at their worst. And a lot of folks at their best too. We can't negate that. I mean, the kindness that we were shown from so many people was incredible. The support the community had was incredible. It was really validating that people viewed us more for just the experience we can provide, but as a part of our local community. At the same time, I had to have some really, really crappy interactions, and it kind of stomped out the fire. And then, speaking of fires, 2020 was, of course, the wildfire vintage. And basically the day the fires hit, I just said, I'm done with the tasting room. We were going to be closing it for a number of weeks anyway. I'm going to work harvest, and then I'm going to take that money I'd saved up to travel and just like take a break. And that went horribly. You know, it is my family's business. I can't just, my family's done much more for me than just offer this career and offer this path. You know, we are very tight-knit. And my coworkers are also more than just like my coworkers. They're helping my family live this dream. And by that summer, I was covering 4 shifts a week and making paninis in the kitchen. And I'm like, okay, this is silly. Like, because the flip side is, I probably could have gotten another tasting room gig somewhere. I probably could have gotten a cellar gig somewhere, but this has a lot more meaning because I know that everything I do here has a much deeper impact than just the day-to-day and the month-to-month and even the year-to-year results. You know, this is something for future generations. This is something where I really get to have, I get to see my work manifested in so much more than just work, but in actual, in my life, my family's lives, and whatever future Lauers may be running around here. And that's a really rare opportunity. And there's a certain level of humility, I think, that whole experience taught me. You know, coming into wine and being so central in a business in your early 20s, now looking back on it, I made a lot of very ego-driven decisions. And I think the last few years has been taking a step back, and especially in national sales, which has been my latest sort of foray. Nothing's more humbling than having to pour wines in like a grocery store storage closet in Dixie cups and having 5 minutes and not being able to point to the beautiful view and not being able to say, don't you feel that wind? Isn't that incredible? You know, you can pour some great wines, but if there's not a spot on the shelf, if they just did their new menu, then none of that matters. And it's really helped me take a step back and see the bigger picture in the wine industry, the business side of the wine industry. You know, there is so much romance inherent to all of this. The work of winemakers is incredible and deserves to be celebrated. But there's a lot more than just what goes on in each different property. This is a massive global industry with humongous forces at play. And that's really helped me put aside the ego in a pretty substantial way and focus more on the bigger picture and how Bryn Mawr plays into it and what we can do to incrementally push conversations forward in the directions they need to go. So I think that's why wine. Also, I love earth, I love rocks, I love wind, I love tasting, I like food, I like how wine plays into it. Farming is definitely the part of the industry that I really like to learn the most about. Winemaking is chaotic and frenetic, yet so controlled and so impressive. It's an extremely dynamic thing. But I think for me, the earth and the dirt are what really, really have been my stranglehold that I just can't let go of. I do love to travel. I love getting to see different wine regions. I was lucky enough to spend a month island hopping around the Canary Islands. And like for those who don't, like the Canaries are to wine what like the Galapagos is to wildlife. Spaniards took grapes there like 500 years ago, and it's evolved into its completely unique sort of grape growing culture, wine growing culture, winemaking culture. They're using varietals there that were never affected by phylloxera. They have 300 to 400-year-old vines still producing fruit. In one particular island, they're farming on a 300-year-old massive volcanic deposit, and it's so windy that they have to dig craters into the earth to farm, and they're yielding 25 kilos per vine, and they're harvesting in August when it's like 100-something degrees outside and 30-mile-per-hour winds, and the wines are still so fresh and vibrant, and like it broke my like VSP is the only way to go, like 8x6 spacing. Like it was just like, oh, there are no actual like fixed rules to how to make good wine. Everywhere has their own unique approach. Mm-hmm. And even within regions, you see so many differing opinions, and that's so cool. It really gave me context for understanding just like the history and the depth of this industry. I mean, it's second or third oldest industry in humanity that's still ongoing. That's pretty damn cool.
Let's talk about the kind of your initial work here. You mentioned obviously a summer in the vineyard followed by a summer in the cellar. Tell me about the first summer and getting familiar with the place and what prompted you to want to come back. What was it about the work? What was it about the place that got you kind of hooked into coming back into the industry?
It's not bad to look at. That's certainly, I mean, you can't deny that. It's very nice to work somewhere that is pretty. And, right now we're sitting near the top of the vineyard, but it gets real steep down there. Mm-hmm. You got to trudge your way up those hills. And so it got me in good shape. I liked that part. I think, though, the big thing for me was, everyone can talk about like block to block variation, but when you're taking fruit weights and the block over there is literally like 70% the weight of the block 50 yards away because it's on a steeper slope or it's on more rock, that's when it's like, oh, like this isn't just something people talk about. There was a very significant tactile nature, and like really actually getting to be in the fields and then taste those wines from prior vintages and understand how, that smaller cluster makes a more structured and intense wine. That's when I realized like the translation of earth and place that you can get with really well-made wines it's not just minutia. I mean, it's profound how different these wines can be. And yet it still takes someone to tell that story. And that's where I think my skill set was discovered. I actually never thought I could be a winemaker because my reference for winemaking was Rachel Rose, who has a master's in enology, a degree in cellular and developmental microbiology, and a postgrad diploma in viticulture. and her vocabulary when it comes to winemaking requires literally 7 to 8 years of study. And so I was just like, what I can do though is help her break some of that down in a way that I can understand so that I can then tell that to people. And I realized I'm good at talking. I'm good at talking about wine. I do have a little bit of like a theatrical side. I did some theater growing up. And once I kind of realized that wine service and wine sales it's kind of a narrative performance. And yet I got insider access to like the primary source. And so I still couldn't legally pour wine that first summer. I wasn't 21 yet. But I was around, I was on the property, I was coming in after the long day looking all sweaty and dirty, and there would be those, that one couple that somehow stumbled their way into our basement. And I could start talking and start telling stories. And that's when I was like, oh, okay, I see where I fit in here. So then the following summer, I would be 21, so I knew I could spend more time in the tasting room. And just getting to hang out with people and talk and tell stories and connect. That was a big part of getting me to come back for sure.
So tell me about your first cellar experience then, working with Rachel that year, and obviously, as you mentioned, she is cool as hell. There's no question about it all. So tell me about working with her and following that down the line into the idea of harvest hopping, the idea of kind of going out and winemaking elsewhere. Kind of take us through the cellar journey for us.
Yeah, so my first summer was summer of 2015. So I was doing a lot of barrel work on the wines that I was helping to cultivate in the vineyard. And so it was really cool seeing, step A go to step B. The big thing I remember that summer was racking for the first time. When you dump out a barrel and clear it out of the lees, I did not expect it to look like that. I mean, especially, so white wine, like Chardonnay lees look like watered down peanut butter. But then red wine lees, when you dump them out and they're like sitting in the little, we didn't used to have drains, so we would have to catch it in like a little flat like service tray. There's like patterns and shapes and rivulets, and it almost looks like effervescent and shiny. It kind of reminds me of like those little like squeezy things you had as a kid. And it was, I still have like deep in my photo archive just like 1,000 different pictures of like lees patterns. But also it's like, ew. It's just like dead yeast bodies. Wild. And that's when I kind of had that realization of like, oh, winemaking's not actually like precious. There's still so much thought and process and fidelity, but it is physical. It is hard work, and I have the L5S1 surgery scar to prove it. It was intense. I mean, honestly, the big cellar days I found a lot more physically aggressive than even some of the big vineyard days. And that's, I also remember getting yelled at for not coiling my hoses. Yelled, politely directed. And yeah, it was just like, oh, like I'm responsible for like a part of someone else's like deep endeavor. And yeah, but I wasn't there for harvest in 2015. I had to go back to school literally like a week before the grapes started coming off because it wasn't a pretty early pick that year. And that was a little disappointing. But then, we were doing some gung-ho stuff down there too. We somehow were trying to fit like 165 barrels in our basement. doing all the winemaking outdoors. Yeah, so the first year I was really part of the winemaking process was 2016. And it was cold and wet, which is also how we discovered that we really like to ferment a little on the colder side. There are some benefits to not having control in certain situations. And yeah, I really loved the physical nature of it, honestly. I did play sports my whole life growing up. I am a lot better when I'm allowed to be moving. And I just liked the process of it all, how there's like the clear start and the clear finish, and here's how we get from start to the finish. And then I think things really started to change and shift, though, for me around 2017, because that was the first time where I sat with Rachel to taste through wines right before bottling. She was 8 months pregnant, and she was just like trying to write tasting notes, and she was just like, I need to know if what I'm saying is crazy or not, because my sense of taste is so out of whack right now. And I was like, sure. And she's like, okay, so like when you're tasting this, do you get like gooseberry? Do you get lychee? And I'm just, I don't know what those are. I'm sorry. And she said, okay, well, you have some music background, right? So like when you taste this, like what's its range? Is this like the soprano? Is this the alto? Is this, and that was the like, right? Because suddenly I had a point of reference. And that's when I think I started to actually develop a vocabulary to talk about wine. And I think that's when I really started to get an analytical perspective and really understand a bigger picture when it came to making wine and blending wine and tasting wine. So over the following couple years, not only was I part of the process, I finally got my forklift certification in 2017. And, being the forklift daddy at the winery is definitely a powerful position. But when like barrel sampling and barrel tasting and even just like topping off barrels and doing a quick smell check, like I finally could be like, okay, like I'm starting to understand you. And, of course, as we're going on, as I'm learning more about the process, I'm asking Rachel more questions. I'm seeing how different procedures done in different vintages have different effects on the wine. 2019 was a particularly grueling harvest. There was no one thing necessarily that defined it, the way like you had the birds in 10 or the fires in 20, but it's just like, if it could have been more complicated, it was. It was late, we're a late ripening site already, and it was just like, let's just have like one shitty little shower every 3 to 4 days. Let's make sure this fruit is never fully dry. Let's just like tell the birds to start a little early, but not actually be catastrophic, but start a little early, just to like poke holes in things and make it messy. There was a lot of craziness that happened that year, and it was definitely the most hours we've ever worked. And I mean, harvest every year is a grueling challenge, which is part of the draw. It does create that almost like, okay, it's basically like we're in summer camp. We're going to be with the same group of people. Nothing else matters. Like, this is our world for 2.5 months, and that is all. And I mean, there's something really positive to say about that. And you do form very long-lasting and important connections by going through that kind of thing with other people. But 2019, I remember, it's like late October. I think we had just registered. The interns and myself had just registered 3 consecutive, like 80+ hour weeks. Rachel was at 100+ hour weeks. I mean, she was sleeping on her couch in the office at one point. And it was like 42 degrees outside, pouring rain. We're all soaking wet. And she just straight up said, like, I'm surprised you guys are all still here. Like, I'm here because I love every second of this and it's my whole life. But like, I'm just shocked that you guys are here. And I don't know, like seeing someone still working that hard and still just like, yeah, of course. This is it. This is everything. I think that's what really made me be like, oh, like cellar, I want to spend more time. Like I want to really, really dig my heels into that world. And that part of the wine industry is still a huge passion of mine. A lot of my friends who I met when I'd first moved to the Valley, they were the folks who were grinding it out in tasting rooms to save some money to start their own brands. And it's been so amazing watching some of my peers like Paul from Seder Fire, Siler Varnum, watching them really take off lately. And sometimes I do get really jealous of the time that they can spend both in the cellar and out in the field. But this Bryn Mawr has grown to the point where a little more specialization is necessary. And unfortunately, during harvest of 2022, my discs decided they were done being in the right place. I wound up having to get some surgery. Through the whole process, we discovered some other discs were kind of on the edge. Bad genes on the mom's side. She had to have the same surgery. My grandma has a whole bunch of implants at this point. So that was kind of the realization of maybe, as much as I romanticize the cellar world, you do still have to have a sense of practicality. And I'm a perfectly decent forklift driver, but there's also the recognition of like, what are you actually best at, and what do you bring to the family business that no one else does? And my gift is definitely in talking. Hopefully that's coming through right now. But yeah, I mean, I love doing tastings, dinners, presentations. I love teaching people both hyper-specific things, which I was able to learn through my experience working hands-on 7 harvests in the cellar. But then also just like, I'm so happy to like take a step back, because I can't talk about how our pre and post maceration trials are making a textural impact without like you knowing what Pinot Noir is. And so I'm also so happy to be the one to step back and help people build that foundation for why any of this even matters. Because I think that's one place where winemakers can get a little ahead of themselves. And it is tough when you're doing such cool and progressive and exciting things. You can't necessarily take that to a country club in Alabama and expect to get the same recognition that you get at your symposium panel. And so I think the wine industry does need those people who can have their feet in both worlds. Because you need that raw intensity of the winemaking community. But you also have to understand, for a lot of people, what draws them to wine is a perception of relaxation and lifestyle and connection to just like stories. And so finding my niche through hospitality, through national sales, and now specifically focused on national sales and like getting to be the guy who doesn't just tell you about Bryn Mawr, but who helps you like learn to appreciate the Willamette Valley, the Eola-Amity Hills, and the greater wine community has been a really, really fun kind of discovery over the last couple of years.
Well, let's talk about that and talk about, you mentioned kind of a storytelling-based model of selling wine. So let's talk about the DTC part of that, the tasting part of that first. Tell us about finding that approach and about what the story is that you find resonates with people.
Sure. So we have a pretty firm rule in the tasting room, which is you're not allowed to tell someone something that's done to a wine without telling them why it matters. When I started going from cellar and cellar work to more of the DTC side, I would talk to people about it's X% new oak for X number of months, native yeast fermented, all these good things, and then I would walk away. And I finally had enough people starting to ask, what does that actually do? It's kind of silly, but every now and then pouring for uneducated customers or uneducated about the wine industry actually makes you think a lot deeper than having some higher level conversations. I learned, one, you can never make assumptions about who you're pouring for. As especially being down in the basement, sometimes you got very curious customers who are trying to find like the next big thing, who are extremely knowledgeable in Oregon wines, who are asking me questions that I didn't know, sent me running to the back to Google things. On the flip side, you also have just like random walk-ins who, are kind of a blank canvas, and you have that duty to like be their welcoming entrance into the wine industry. There is a certain amount of expectation and pretension in the wine industry. People in the industry know how silly that can be, but people in the industry also know how true that can be. And folks who don't consume wine, one of the biggest reasons why most give that answer is like, it just seems too much, either too pretentious, too expensive, too high of a threshold to really break into. And that's just such a shame, because at the very foundation, it's so simple. Wine is as complicated as you want it to be. I mean, you can spend an entire life studying different tenaliers and just focused on one tiny sliver of what makes this entire industry function. At the same time, it can, and for many people should be, as simple as, this tastes good, I like it, thank you. And so that's why I think over time we really stepped back on focusing on technical information and just telling people, like, this is why we make this wine. We make the Tempranillo because those vines were here when we got here. And it wound up being really successful, and it wound up being different, and it wound up being, a huge part of what makes Bryn Mawr what it is today, because having that wine has taught us, locals especially, are excited about alternative wines. We make our Willamette Valley Pinot because the rest of the country still wants a damn good Willamette Valley Pinot at a very good price. And allowing these wines to grow into like personalities and develop their identities, I think people connect a lot more with that than like, unfortunately, tech info. I love a tech sheet. Don't get me wrong. This is not necessarily personal, but that's the difference between someone who's been working in wine for 10 plus years versus someone who goes wine tasting once every few months and just, wants to grab a couple good local bottles.
So when you're focusing on the story, what's the important thing you want to get across, and what do you find resonates most with your customers?
See, that's so difficult because different things resonate with different people. So part of the most important part of DTC is getting to know your customer. I have, at this point, like 50 different stories for 50 different people. Some folks want to know kind of the family history, and I've lived that, so that one's pretty easy to tell. You might have like a well-established couple on the brink of retirement who wants to know of like, what can a second life look like? And then I can tell them, my parents' story and how they went from working as attorneys to where we are now. and how that was a major transition, and we probably could have done some more research. Or the dynamics of having a family business. There are people who are really, really just interested in the logistics of how this all works. There are definitely people who are much more focused on farming, who want to know all the details, where regenerative practices are going. When we say sustainable, which we're saying less and less industry-wide, you're hearing regenerative much more frequently. What does that actually mean? What does sustainability look like? What does, why is hand picking more important than machine harvesting? All those minutiae. And then there are some people who really just want to drink, and that's okay. And we can't necessarily chase those people off because they don't want it the same way we do. And so the storytelling aspect is so personal. And I don't think one story is necessarily better than another story, but I definitely have those points that we hit early on, and I try to see what people are resonating with and then build from there.
So you talked about your sort of transition into national sales, so selling the same wine but in a very different way. So I'm curious about getting yourself up to speed on the differences there and how to approach a sale when you, like you say, you don't have the view, you don't have the scenery, you don't have the home field advantage.
Yeah, it's way harder. I was very lucky. So first, before I get too deep into this, I'm very lucky to have very good neighbors. The folks at Bethel Heights, folks at Left Coast, folks at Illahee have all been wonderful, wonderful resources that have significantly helped me understand what it takes to be successful on the national side of things. Sometimes it really does just come down to right place at right time. You find someone right as they're running out of inventory of something, or for some reason their other distributor didn't deliver an Oregon Pinot last week and you jump on that opportunity. A big part of it is honing down the details of what really matters to different accounts. If I walk into a store with a heavy organic and regenerative focus, guess what I'm going to be focusing on with our wines? If I walk into a store and I see shelf talkers with scores on every one of those wines, let's bust out the score sheet. Honestly, it's not that different with DTC in that aspect of you have 30 seconds to figure out who you're pouring wine to and take everything in as fast as possible. You can fall into the trap of making assumptions, which is dangerous. But that's sales. You have to work on certain heuristics and certain ideas. Different regions of the country I also find to respond to very different things, or at least give very different impressions. I don't really focus all that much on the Northeast right now. It's a very crowded market up there, and people tend to be a little more rushed in their tastings, whereas sometimes when I'm tasting in the South and the Southeast, I'm the one looking at my watch, we're gonna get to our next appointment, you guys, come on, you don't also have to open wines to talk about them, come on, you gotta get going. But almost all my best markets right now are in the South and Southeast. I think there's a wonderful opportunity for Oregon wine out there. I think our wine pairs extremely well with the local cuisine. The higher acid, more fresh flavors of Oregon wines work really well with rich and fatty Southern foods. Especially, the sparkling wine movement that you're seeing happening in the Willamette Valley. Sparkling wine and fried chicken is absolutely heavenly. One of the best pairings in the entire wine industry. And I'm seeing sales on our Brut Rosé just absolutely taking off down there right now. And sometimes you walk into an account and you can pretty instantly tell, this isn't the place for us. Which is not to say you tune out or don't still, pour the wines and do a good job, but there is a certain amount of just you can kind of tell when you walk into a place where this is going to go. be it by the enthusiasm of the person you're meeting, the quality of the wines on their shelves, the size of the account. If we're tasting, as I mentioned before, if we're tasting out of Dixie cups, probably not the right place for a 1,000 case lot of Oregon Pinot. But once again, like you can't be sure anytime. And I think that's the hardest thing I've had to deal with in national sales is with DTC. If you do a good job, give a good performance, show a good lineup of wines, there's a pretty instant reward, be it either through a nice sale, a hearty thank you, a 5-star Google review, just a really nice smile, that was great, thank you so much. With national sales, the reward structure is very, very different, and that was something that was really, really difficult for me to discover and feel out as I was getting more into this world. When I started, I was still kind of giving the tasting room pitch of we're so high elevation, it's very windy here, it's very rocky here, talking about tactile things that when you're here, yeah, there's the rock, there's the wind, there's the elevation, right? And so I've shifted the focus a little more onto the vineyard practices and the winemaking techniques that are going on here. Rachel's doing some very novel and very interesting things that still lie within the realm of high fidelity winemaking. For example, with the Brut Rosé, we're using 3 to 4 different kinds of vessels, egg-shaped vessels, neutral puncheons. We're using a variety of different grapes. We're doing some non-vintage stuff with a big Cellar tank back there. These are all things that your average smart wine buyer is going to have in their vocabulary. And yet it also displays the intentionality that is going into these wines. The Brut Rosé in particular is always the first wine I pour. And I think it's the wine that really does speak best to sort of the ethos that is going on here, which is not just having one ethos. When you have a toolkit like Rachel does, you can really pick from so many different ways to make wine to craft something that is novel yet excellent. Because the Brut Rosé, she's like a down and dirty forced carb fancy soda stream wine. On the other hand, it also has a 93 in Editor's Choice from Enthusiast and is our best-selling wine in the tasting room and is pretty widely regarded as one of the best examples of forced carb wine, if not on the West Coast, then out there on the market right now. And it's because she's treating the base wine with such intention and doing so much through the winemaking process to develop these different tones and these different textures. Some of it's just direct press, some of it's 4 days on the skins, some of it's in eggs, right? It's there's so many different bits and pieces that are going into this wine, and yet we can still get it on shelf for a really reasonable price. And that's part of what's going on here. We're trying to make the best wines using all the tools that we have available, and luckily she has so many tools available. And so talking about that reframes Bryn Mawr as we're that high elevation spot up on the hill to this is this is a place that will have impact on how wine is being made in the Willamette Valley going forward, thanks to Rachel and her approaches. And every wine we make has something pretty cool about it. With our Pinot Noir program, we're using some concrete. We're doing studies and trials on non-Saccharomyces-related yeast strains. With our Riesling and Pinot Blanc program, we're experimenting with sandstone as a vessel for fermentation and aging. So there's a lot of innovation happening inside our winery right now. And I think that's where I'm able to reframe Bryn Mawr as we're making good wines as you would expect in this area. To not only are we making good wines right now, but we are going to continue to be making better wines in 10 years. And that is, because for national sales, temporality is your enemy. People want to know that if they pick up this wine and they give it a spot on their shelf, that not only will they be able to restock it, but their customers are going to keep buying it because it continues to stay just as good, if not improve over time. And so, yeah, it's once again removing from the tech info, well, I guess that's a little more techy, but removing from just like, here's what makes this particular wine taste good, to here's why this wine deserves recognition and notice, if that makes sense.
I liked earlier you talked about kind of the selling wine as being just kind of a performance for you, or taking that. So tell me about, outside of the direct sales like that, winemaker dinners, presentations, things like that. Tell me about, as you're approaching the education side of wine, what are the kind of the key points, not just for Bryn Mawr, but as you mentioned for the Eola Amity Hills, for Oregon. What is the key stuff about Oregon wine that is still lesser known that you're trying to get out into the world?
We know all about how the farming here is truly superlative. Like the bar of farming in this valley, I really can't think of anywhere else in the world that equals it. I mean, this is not to say anything about the other parts in the world, but when you talk about progressive farming practices and the almost universal acceptance of regenerative farming, Oregon really is, on average, so much more unique than so many other places. And I think a lot of folks who I pour for are still a little, they're more likely to ask if we're a volcanic site or a marine sediment site than like, how do you guys farm? So I really think that the farming is the number one thing about this valley that still deserves to be highlighted and celebrated even more than it already rightfully is. Eola Amity Hills in particular, this area has a really interesting story because there's actually more acreage planted in Eola Amity than any of the other sub-AVAs in the valley. This has always been like the growers' neighborhood. And, my family has been part of this slow shift towards, we're not just growing here. We've actually got some incredible winemaking talent. And in the last 10 years, that has all just exploded. This neighborhood, when your neighbors are folks like Bethel Heights and Christum and Walter Scott and Lingua Franca and Evening Land, it's just like, good God. I know I will make the argument that this neighborhood has some of the highest concentrations of winemaking talent and skill in the valley now. And yet the families are the ones still dominating the culture in the Eola Amity Hills. The board of our AVA is, well, I'm on it. My mom's the president. We have, Bjornson is always represented. Zenith historically has been well represented. I mean, it really is the families that drive the culture of what the Eola Amity Hills is doing. And there are definitely some bigger guys moving into the area. But I think there's still a grounded humility that really distinguishes this AVA from other parts. We have been okay with quietly making some of the best wine, if not the best wine, in the valley for a while now. That's always a dangerous game to play when it comes to marketing and sales. But I think we're happy to be the if you know neighborhood. And that's how I really feel Eola Amity is. That is shifting, I'm not going to lie. The last since from when I started doing national sales just a few years ago to now, a lot more folks are familiar with just how superlative this area is. And yet the number of people who know Eola Amity Hills without knowing like why it's named the Eola Hills, right? It's because of the wind. It ties to Aeolus, right? Keeper of the winds in Greek mythology. Like that is what makes this region so significant. Honestly, it's harder to pin down like what makes Eola Amity wine what it is compared to some other AVAs. I can blind out Dundee or Yamhill with no issue. Like they have such distinct characters to me, and it's because of the similarities in soils in those areas. Eola Amity has literally every soil type in the valley. In fact, there's a vineyard just about 200 yards down there where you're essentially walking on oyster fossils. Meanwhile, right behind your shoulder there, you're looking at the most basalt boulders you could ever see. This area has an incredibly diverse array of different soils and mixes. And so it does make us look above the ground at the climate, the winds up here. Wind is the uniting factor of the Eola Amity Hills. We get absolutely blasted by the corridor on a very, very consistent basis. And it means that whatever Eola Amity wines have to say, they tend to say with their chest out. It's the intensity, it's the brilliant acids in the white wines, the structural backbone of the red wines. They're extremely age-worthy wines, and they can have a little more attitude. They can be a little more sharp and snappy and aggressive. But, it's not like they all taste like cherries. It's much more difficult to actually give a unifying identity other than just like more. But we love character. I mean, that's why so many people get deeper into wines, is to get to know those distinctive characters in their wines. And the wines here just have such a clear and intense voice. And what I really think Eola Amity is going to be known for more than anything over the next 20 years is Chardonnay. I think it's kind of hard to dispute at this point that Eola Amity is the focal point of the Willamette Valley Chardonnay Renaissance. Not only do you have brilliant producers who have been making great Chardonnay for decades now, and folks like Bethel Heights and Evening Land, but the X vineyards, right? Ex Omni, Ex Novo, what Walter Scott has been doing with Chardonnay, what Christum is doing with Chardonnay these days. Our Chardonnays here have always been some of our top performing, if not the most impressive wines we've been making. I don't think there are many other vineyards and other AVAs that are dedicated purely to Chardonnay, like you see in the Eola Amity Hills. And of course, the issue with Chardonnay out here has never been the quality. It's been teaching consumers to actually taste it. And so for a number of years, we've actually had a rule in our tasting room where you are not allowed to sub Chardonnay out of a flight. But if you don't like it, you can pick anything else that is either open or not. And we will pour it for your table, and we'll make sure you leave tasting 6 wines that you've enjoyed. But you have to try it. And there was a period there for a while in 22 where we were actually totally sold out of Chardonnay for like 4 or 5 months. So we've grafted over Pinot Noir to Chardonnay on our estate. We planted more Chardonnay in 2019. We're also doing the same with Pinot Blancs and Rieslings. We're grafting Pinot over to Pinot Blanc and Riesling. The white wines in this area are just so brilliant. The acids are just ripping. And that super high acid profile means that we can play around with developing weight and texture and base notes in our winemaking and have these just remarkably complete wines that demonstrate such a tremendous breadth. And, I mentioned the whole kind of like a vocal comparison with before, is this wine soprano, alto, baritone. The great Chardonnays coming from this area right now are the whole damn choir. Like the way that they bridge such a variety of tones in such a harmonious way. Like this is why Chardonnay will never be like cast from the wine industry. Because great Chardonnays of this world are still such important and dramatic wines that deserve all the love and attention.
You mentioned earlier the different types of stories you talk about in the tasting room, the different types of questions people have, and you mentioned obviously family dynamics as one. And so we're going to talk about family dynamics for a moment because you brought it up. We have to ask. Yeah. Tell me about the growth of Bryn Mawr, the growth of the business, the growth of the space itself, and also kind of along that line, the growth of the family dynamic in it, you and your sister working in it, and how it has gone and where it's going.
Yeah. So. When I started, we'll take it from 2016. So the first 6 years, I really can't take credit for anything. That was all my dad and Rachel, clearing out land, planting the vines. They had to use crowbars to plant certain lots because of how rocky it was. Rachel lived on site for those first 6.5, 7 years. And when I came into it, it was already a pretty well-developed adolescent operation. And I got to kind of jump in on the momentum that they had already been building. And then for those first couple years, it was the three of us between 2016 and 2018 when we started getting to the point where we needed to bring on another couple full-time folks. And for better or worse, my dad gave me a lot of free rein in the tasting room, probably for worse in hindsight. And, he was doing the management of the business. I was doing pretty much all the tasting room stuff. We put in like a new point of sale system in 2017, and I was kind of the architect behind all of that. But yeah, handing your DTC operation to a 23-year-old. Jeez, come on, dude. Like, we still did well. I still grew a lot. But I will say, once my sister came in, which was in 2022, I'm skipping ahead a little bit. I realized, we needed more structure. So, the family dynamic in a business is tenuous. Undeniably, because I absolutely got away with things I shouldn't have gotten away with. At the same time, I also contributed a lot more than the average person my age with my experience should have been able to contribute. There were very tense discussions at dinner. There were times where it was impossible to separate family and business because they are inherently now not separated. And there were absolutely times where I would yearn to just be normal, or even to leave the winery. My brother doesn't work in the business. Sometimes I'm really jealous because, for him talking about the winery with my parents is a break from his world. Whereas for me, it's deeply central. And we actually had to create rules of once again, bless my sister. She created a monthly meeting that was on the calendar where no alcohol was allowed to be involved, with an agenda to talk about some of the more pertinent and prescient things that are going on. And when my sister was coming back, I was nervous for sure. Because this was right at the time when I was starting to transition to national sales. So at the time we had a director of hospitality, and she was leaving a different career, which she'll tell you all about. And I was worried because she was going to be working in the tasting room, and that historically had been my world. And we are both strong personalities, and we both know we're right. And yeah, those first few months, there was some tension. and some of the sibling dynamic started to bleed onto the floor. And on one hand, like, we're a family business. Sometimes that's fun and good. On the other hand, you know, we have a full-time team now. Like, we have employees and a staff who have been here for a while and who we want to stay here for a while. And we need to know when to keep some things behind closed doors. And there was one incident where voices got raised in front of the staff, and at the end of it, we kind of came to a common understanding, like, we're here trying to achieve the same thing. Like, the last thing we should be doing is stepping on each other's toes and getting in the way of each other. And honestly, after that conversation, it's been incredibly smooth. She and I work really, really well together as a team. You know, we both are clearly in our own spheres, which is probably for the best. But even when there's overlap, we're really on the same page. She understands what I really find valuable when it comes to the tasting room. You know, I really do want to make sure that we still give a superlative demonstration of our wines when they're being poured, that it never feels formulaic or robotic. And then I know for her, like, I know that she brings things to the table that I never did in terms of the structural organization of the tasting room. You know, I made a lot of decisions based on vibes, and that was fine when it was just me down there in a basement, because then it is like, oh yeah, gung-ho garage winery, but you know, when we're hosting someone's memorial service, maybe the vibes aren't the best thing to go off of. Maybe a little more planning is super helpful, and she's very good at that, so I appreciate that a lot. And now we're entering a really interesting place. You know, she's a couple years older than I am. My dad is turning 70 this year. My mom retired a couple years ago from her career, but is now doing some consulting stuff on the side that, as per usual with my mom, she put herself fully into, and then is still pretty occupied out there. So, you know, we're starting to talk about 5-year plans, 10-year plans. You know, for my dad, it's not like he's gonna retire overnight. They will always be involved in certain capacities. But she and I are both pretty ambitious, and we see, I mean, she planned 35 events this summer. Unbelievable. And, you know, I was on the road for like 20 weeks last year, and I want to continue this momentum that we're starting to develop on the national side of things. And, you know, it is getting to the point of like, okay, so who's going to be doing what in 5 years? And, you know, Dad, do you still want to be doing payroll when you're 80? You know, what does this process look like? And that's been tough, because you don't want to make it feel like you're trying to replace your own dad. You don't want it to necessarily be like, yeah, Dad, you can't do this like, that's not helpful for anybody, and it's not true. But I also want him to do what he wants to do. He's earned the right to do that now. And his favorite thing to do is stock shelves. Like, you should be able to stock shelves without me asking if you paid that bill back yet. And so that's kind of the current situation, is we're on the cusp of serious transitions. But like, I still need my parents. I'm not ready to fly solo entirely, even though I really do kind of make all the decisions in my realm. And she makes pretty much all the decisions in her realm, and we essentially keep them informed of what we're doing. But yeah, she and I over the last couple of years have definitely we're not trying to pull the reins away. It's just that we're creating all these new things from the start, from the ground up, that we are taking ownership of. So I know they're really proud of how much we've both committed over the last couple of years. They've made that really apparent. And luckily we were always a very tight-knit community, or tight-knit family before going into the business, but it's a wild combination of over-familiarity and just a little too much of each other sometimes. But I think we're doing a much better job of it than we ever thought we would have 15 years ago. And I think the results are speaking for themselves. And I'm talking about my parents and my sister, but like at this point, Rachel's in the fold. She's just been so central to everything here for so long that it would feel wrong to make any sort of significant decision without her being part of the conversation.
So let's look ahead a little bit then for you specifically, and for Bryn Mawr as you want. Tell me about, as you're talking about 5-10-year plans for yourself, for the business, what is next and what have you not done yet that you want to accomplish?
Sure. I know my primary focus for at least the next 5 years, if not up to the next 10, is the national sales. It's a little gross to say it, but having my last name does make an impact in this job. When the primaries in the family show up, that does make a pretty strong impact, especially as you're trying to get initial market presence. And I just know that I can tell our story better than anyone right now. The unfortunate thing with national sales is the better I am at it, the less I actually get to be home. And I like my home. I got my house in West Salem during the pandemic and quickly and aggressively started gardening. And while I've had a very strong focus on drought-tolerant and native perennials, my peonies did not look too hot last year. And they're really pretty, and I like those. And I want to be able to start growing my veggies. And it's installing a drip system with timing, it's so complicated. I like standing there with the hose. And so, do I really want to? I've talked to some folks who work at larger wineries who do national sales, and they can be on the road 30 to 40 weeks a year. And I think I value this a little too much to not be here for it. We're finally reaching the point where the grinding is getting realized and paying off. And look, I understand in the wine industry, there's no point where you actually get to put your feet up. But at the very least, it's cool to see people in the tasting room on a Monday. It's nice to know that all this work and all this effort has been worthwhile. And if I'm gone all the time, then you don't actually get to feel that reward. So I think, the national sales, I'll continue to really, suck the marrow out of that over the next 5 to 8, possibly up to 10 years. But, by the time I'm well into my 40s, I don't see that being my career for the next 30 years, right? And hopefully at that point, I'll have established strong enough relationships. Our wines will be known nationally as the best. And we'll just have our whole kind of narrative as a winery so well established at that point that it will be a little easier to hand it off to somebody else. One thing I really want to do more of is develop a deeper understanding of the farming from the vineyard side. I mean, I did some of it practically, but like soil science is so sick. You know, I want to know just a little bit more deeply about why certain decisions are made. Because, right, Rachel is also our vineyard director and is totally in charge of that. And she definitely brings the biochemistry understanding to the vineyard. But I would really like to spend more time just in the vines with the grapes, getting to know, you know, some of the vines behind me. They were just planted like 5 or 6 years ago. I can't wait to like learn their personalities and learn what challenges they have to deal with here that we didn't have to deal with at the older blocks by the house that I was part of farming. And you know, the viticulture, once again, to me, like that is the entire foundation of everything. And I just want to spend more time out there. But I also, like, I gotta say, some of our neighbors have really gone all in on the gardening side of things, like planting out the huge pollinator gardens and the native things. And like, if in 20, 30 years you just see me like out in a patch of dirt playing around with some flowers, I'm not gonna be mad about that. That sounds pretty nice too. Like, I see a giant pile of rocks over there that you could put so many things in that. So many things, so many little like stone crops, sedums, and like, you know, just have something for the bees to enjoy too. Yeah, you know, my sister, I think she's really found her niche in as the director of hospitality here. And she's significantly better as a personnel manager than I ever was. So I definitely, you know, I think she's really carved herself. But, you know, the longest I've ever had one position has been this, like 2.5 years. I've always been the one who jumped in and filled any other crack that came up. And so the idea of doing the same job for like 15 years is daunting for me right now. I think I always sort of want to be the one who sees Bryn Mawr on the bigger picture. There's always something that is going to happen in the wine industry. There's always a surprise. And just being the guy who's been here for most of those in the most different places is always important to have. So I don't know if there's an actual title for that. But I definitely, like, you know, I think I'm the most well-equipped to be able to just jump in case of emergency.
I think that would make you the archivist of the place.
Right.
You're the institutional memory of the place.
Yes.
Perfect. Love that. Let's talk about the industry a little bit at a larger scale. You mentioned obviously your kind of initial impressions and some of the growth, especially amongst in the neighborhood as you've seen. Tell me about where the industry is right now in 2025. What does Oregon wine look like, and where is it going?
It's no secret. Things are a little harder out there than they've been for a very long time. You know, the U.S. wine industry has essentially enjoyed a golden age of uninterrupted growth for like 60 years. And ultimately, growth in every aspect needs to be checked. You know, the unfortunate thing from a more short-term perspective is Oregon was so rapidly growing in the 2010s, and it just felt like the tide was unstoppable. And so in the mid to late 2010s, you know, between like 2015 and 2019, so many new vineyards were planted. So many people were getting into the wine industry. We planted more vines. We're absolutely part of that. Right as all those vines are coming to life, right as all those wines are getting ready for the market, things took a turn. And we managed to survive that turn longer than some other West Coast places did, but it has really started to reach the Willamette Valley as well. I think we have fewer issues than some other places do, for sure. I think, we have the advantage still of being able to dry farm, so we're not going to be dealing with the water wars that you might start seeing in other wine regions, that you are seeing in other wine regions. We know the quality of what we produce, and we have much better climate outlook, even though better is still tenuous given long-term outlooks. Ours is still better than many other wine-growing regions, so we have that going for us. I think the thing that's really scaring me right now is how quickly bottle prices are rising. It's the worst possible time for that to be happening because finances for many people are as tight as they've ever been. I think there's kind of been a push for luxurification that is both justified due to the high quality, the exceptionally high quality of the wines we've been producing in the last 10 years. I mean, Oregon wine, my point of reference is still relatively young, but I mean, what you're seeing from the wines out of 21, 22, and little secret, 24 is gonna blow like everything out of the water. I mean, we deserve to respect that at the highest level. At the same point, we can't all be fighting for the same spot on the same shelf. You need to have a diverse and interesting wine region. And it just, I do feel like a lot of folks are just going for the same person right now. And we all love that person. We love the person who respects small batch vineyard and block designate Pinot Noirs that tell of time and place. Half of us are that person. But that is a relatively limited type of person to go for. And I know we're all trying our best to help create more of those people, but it's going to be hard to create those people if the price points are getting out of hand. And we're just not really at a place, I think, economically as a culture to support some of this right now. I do think Oregon is much better at telling stories than other wine regions are. I don't think we necessarily just rely on name the way that some other wine regions do, which is very helpful for us going forward. And, I mean, we can control what we can control, which is growing good grapes and making good wines. We can have some ingenuity. We can try some different varietals and different techniques. Sure, that's all part of the discussion. But there are certainly larger forces at play that, we can only do so much about, like the push towards sobriety in younger generations. Can only do so much about the legalization of marijuana and how that's affected drinking patterns. And we can either dig our heels in right now, or we can have harder conversations right now. And I mean, has the wine industry been as inventive as the cocktail industry has been over the last 10 years? Not at all. At the same time, you see what happened with the microbrewing industry, which maybe got a little too inventive to the point where it almost turned people off. You can only drink so much unicorn fuzzbutt double hazy IPA. Like, at a certain point, we gotta all take a step back too. But like, I don't think digging our heels in right now is going to give us broader appeal, especially to potential new consumers. I think a lot of the existing consumers have reached a saturation point. And the only way we're going to figure out how to draw new people in is by providing wines with stories, with approachability. But that's hard if you want to farm at the highest level and make wine at the highest level. And I think that's where our great reckoning is right now, is what do we sacrifice to make that happen? Because if everyone wanted to make wines exactly the way we wanted to make them, then we'd drop yields to oblivion. We'd use only the highest quality everything through the whole process. We'd all take 2 years in barrel and 5 years in bottle before we released them, and they would cost $2.50 a bottle. We know that makes a freaking incredible wine. But where does the practicality come in, and how do we get someone to appreciate that kind of wine without taking the baby steps to get them into wine in general? And I think being so deeply into wine by my early 20s and having to have these conversations with my non-wine drinking friends does at least give me a little more of a window compared to someone like my folks, who their entire social group for the 25 years before getting into the wine industry was wine drinking folks and collectors. And I mean, when I go to a restaurant, I'm probably ordering a cocktail, they're a lot more exciting sometimes. And so, there's more competition, there's more pressure. And I think the more creative folks get in the short term, the more we'll be able to weather the storm. The question is, how do we get creative, and how do we stay agile without sacrificing the very critical history that is so deeply fundamental and deeply woven into the wine industry?
So last question for you. Obviously, you mentioned you've been in the industry about a decade now. You kind of came in sort of by accident.
Yeah.
I'm curious, as you look back now, what's either the biggest thing you've learned or the biggest sort of takeaway you've had from the industry? What is it about Oregon wine or wine in general that has either been the biggest thing keeping you here, or the biggest surprise you've learned along the way?
I think how wine can be so many things all at once. It can be so simple in that, at its most basic level, it's like carefully controlled spoilage. It can also be the most complex and layered thing you could ever think of, with so many different factors that all have to come into play to create something that tells story in the way that no other real product that we consume does. There are other things that tell story of place, but when you bring time into the picture, that's so special. And, the way that little things from the past get etched into a grape grower and winemaker's experience, like how many people remember that 25-minute rainstorm on September 3rd, 2018 at 5:15 p.m. That was the first rain we had in 93 days. We got half an inch and it delayed our pick by 3 weeks because of how much water the fruit took in, right? Like, the fact that such small things can have such big impacts on our lives and on the wines we make, it is that necessary romance. You can break it down into all its individual component parts and spend lifetimes studying each one of those individual component parts. But it really is like that intangible, that romantic, deep interweaving of things that are both so simple and so complex, that so few things in life, I think, offer. And so, when I open a bottle of wine, most of the time it's not really to think about it. It's just to enjoy it. But if I want to think about it, I can think about so much, and think about the people behind it, the place behind it. And I will never get bored being in the wine industry.
It's a fantastic answer. I love that. all the questions I have for you today. Anything I didn't ask that I should have? Anything we didn't cover today that you wanted to cover?
I don't think so. I think I rambled a lot.
It was a pretty controlled ramble, I would say. No, it's fantastic. You tell a great story, and we appreciate you taking the time to share your story, to share your beautiful space with us. We'll go ahead and let you off the hook.
It's a pleasure.
Thank you.